Inside a packed Harvard lecture hall, mathematics professor Amelia Carter slammed her chalk against the desk and smirked at the janitor mopping the floor near the back row. She bet that a man pushing a bucket could never solve the equation that had defeated her entire department for years. The crowd laughed as she started a 2-minute countdown on the screen behind her. Then the janitor quietly leaned his mop against the wall, walked up to the podium, and picked up the chalk. No one in that room realized this moment would destroy the reputation of a Harvard genius. Long before the cameras turned on, before the live stream carried his back into mathematics departments in 3 different countries, Elias Reed was already inside the auditorium where it would all happen. He came in through the side door at 5 in the morning with a ring of keys and a cart, the way he had come in every weekday for almost a decade. The room was dark and cold and smelled faintly of old wood polish. The chalkboard at the front still carried the equations from yesterday's lecture, half erased, ghosted in dust. He set the cart down at the foot of the stage and turned on a single overhead light. His eyes traveled across the chalk lines, the way another man might read a newspaper slowly, top to bottom, with a small, involuntary tightening at the corner of his mouth whenever something landed. The professor who had written them was a tenured number theorist, and the third step contained a small error. Elias had noticed it 3 weeks earlier on a Wednesday, while wiping the same board. He had not said anything then, and he did not say anything now. He cleaned around the chalk lines carefully, the way someone preserves a thing he is not sure belongs to him. Upstairs, the graduate student lounge had a small whiteboard covered in half-finished problem sets, and he stopped to read it the way other people stop at a shop window. None of the work was good. He noted it without judgment and kept moving. It was not the first time he had read a board no one had thought to lock behind them. That was how the building knew him, a figure in gray coveralls with a name tag nobody read. He emptied trash cans on the second floor, mopped the long marble hallway outside the dean's suite, restocked the soap in the faculty restroom on the third. He nodded at the few professors who arrived before sunrise, and most of them nodded back without looking up from their phones. He knew the codes for half the supply closets and all of the back stairwells. He did not know any of the faculty by their first names, and none of them knew his. A teaching assistant named Hannah Pierce sometimes said good morning to him in the elevator, on her way up to teach the introductory courses, and that was the closest thing he had to a relationship in the building. Once on a snowy morning the previous February, she had held the elevator for him when he was pushing a cart loaded with broken chairs. He had thanked her quietly, and she had smiled at him, and the door had closed. She had thought about that small exchange more than once over the months that followed. Down in the basement behind a door marked Maintenance B, there was a folding table he had quietly turned into something else. On it sat a stack of textbooks, pulled from the campus discard pile, and a row of legal pads filled in pencil, from the first page to the last. Each one dated on the cover in his small, blocky handwriting. There was a desk lamp he had bought with his own money at a hardware store across the river, and a folding chair that did not quite sit straight on the concrete floor. He came down here on his breaks. He came back at night after the building emptied, and sat in the cone of yellow light until 2 in the morning, working through problems no one had asked him to solve. He had been chasing one in particular for over a year. It was a problem he had first seen on a printout left in the faculty lounge 14 months earlier, abandoned next to a paper cup, half a stale donut, and a department memo about parking permits. The problem belonged to a corner of analytic number theory that had defeated 3 separate teams over the past 9 years, each one arriving at a partial result that contradicted the others. He had read all 3 of the published attempts. He could feel that something was wrong somewhere in the chain, early in the chain, but he had not yet been able to say what. He had been stuck a single step short of the end for months. Taped to the inside cover of the same notebook was a photograph. A younger version of him, thinner, with longer hair, standing in a doctoral cohort at a university 3 states away. He did not look at it often. He did not need to. He remembered the year that everything in his personal life came apart at once. The loss of his advisor to a hospital ward, the bills that arrived faster than the small stipend could meet them, the long bus rides home through a city that began to feel like it was closing on him from every direction. He had withdrawn from the program before the program could withdraw him. That part of his life he kept folded shut, the way a man keeps a letter he cannot bring himself to throw away. He had taken the only job in this building that did not ask him to explain anything. The pay was steady, the work was quiet, and the chalkboards were everywhere. 2 floors above him in a corner office that overlooked the river, Amelia Carter was already at her desk. She had not slept much. She did not need to. The symposium was hers, her name on every flyer, in every hallway, her photograph on the auditorium screen, her conjecture in every department newsletter that had gone out that week. She had run the morning rehearsal twice the camera angles 3 times. She had checked the lighting on the chalkboard against her own image in the back wall of the hall. Nothing in her schedule was accidental. She had not lost a public debate since her 2nd year of graduate school, and at 36, she had built a reputation the way other people build a fortune, carefully in increments, with a sharp eye on the people standing nearest to her. She wrote 2 papers a year and reviewed 20. She turned down dinner invitations from colleagues she considered second tier and accepted only the ones that came from people whose recommendation she might one day need. A colleague had said to her the previous week, while they were both pouring coffee in the lounge, that being unbeatable made for a lonely career. She had looked at him for a moment, smiled, and said that the alternative was worse. 9 years earlier, in her first year on faculty, she had published a paper proposing a problem she claimed no one in her field would solve within her lifetime. The problem had been refined, reissued, and reframed several times since, and it now traveled under the same name it had been given at her tenure party: the Carter conjecture. 9 years of unsolved standing. 9 years of academic medals she did not wear on her chest, but kept neatly in the way she walked into a room. The symposium that morning was a publicity event as much as a scholarly one, and she did not pretend otherwise. She had requested the live stream herself. She wanted the conjecture to travel. She wanted the next generation of graduate students in Berlin and Cambridge and Princeton to hear her name and feel a small, useful pressure behind it. She had told a colleague at a conference in October that the goal of an academic career was not to be respected, but to be unavoidable. The colleague had not laughed. When she walked down the hallway toward the auditorium at 9:15, she passed a man in gray coveralls, pushing a cart against the wall to let her by. She did not look up. He kept his eyes on the floor. They had passed each other in that exact hallway, perhaps 400 times over the years, and neither of them had ever said a word. The auditorium filled fast. 3 cameras were positioned at the front. The live stream went on at 9:30. Amelia took the podium to a polite, expectant round of applause, and she let it settle before she spoke. She opened with her conjecture, writing a clean version of it on the chalkboard in steady, looping handwriting, the kind of handwriting that signaled to anyone in the room with a doctorate that she had done this many times. She talked through the structure of the problem for about 6 minutes, the original framing the failed attempts, the partial results that had been published, and quietly retracted. The audience listened the way audiences listen to a soloist who has not yet made a mistake. Then she set the chalk down and turned around. The smile was the one she used when she was about to do the part of the talk that she enjoyed most. She told the audience that anyone in the room who could produce a complete and correct solution to the conjecture in 2 minutes would receive a public apology from her on this stage, in front of all of Harvard. She added, almost as an afterthought, that she would also write that person a recommendation letter to any department in the world. The audience laughed. A few people clapped. She walked the front row, slowly looking for the right undergraduate to call on the kind of student who would be flustered and gracious and play along for the camera. She had done this routine at 4 conferences already that year. Her eyes traveled past the front row, past the middle, past the back. Then her gaze landed on the rear exit, where a man in gray coveralls was running a damp mop across a small patch of floor near the wall. He had come in to clean up a spilled coffee somebody had left near the door, and he had not looked up since. Something amused in her face shifted. She leaned slightly toward the microphone. "I will take a challenger from anyone in the room," she said, her voice steady. Even the gentleman in the back with the bucket. The audience turned in their seats. There was a hesitation, the kind of hesitation that happens before people decide what kind of moment they are inside. Then someone in the third row laughed, and the rest of the room followed. Elias did not look up. He kept the mop moving in a slow figure 8, and his face did not change. In the front row, Hannah Pierce shifted in her seat and glanced back toward the rear of the hall. She had seen the janitor in the math hallways for as long as she had been in the program. She had never once introduced herself to him properly, and right now, she was not sure why she was suddenly bothered by that. "I'm serious," Amelia said into the microphone. "If you can solve it in 2 minutes, I will publicly admit on this stage in front of all of Harvard that I was wrong. And I will write you a letter of recommendation." That line drew the loudest laugh of the morning. 2 students near the front raised their phones to film. A professor in the second row shook his head and grinned at the colleague next to him. In the second row from the back, Daniel Whitman, the chair of the mathematics department, sat very still. He had a habit of reading any room he walked into, and what he was reading now did not entirely match the mood the laughter was selling. Amelia turned to the screen behind her and tapped the touch panel on the podium. The countdown timer appeared. 2 minutes in white digits against a black background. She started it. The cameras did what cameras do. One of them panned to the back of the auditorium and held its frame on the janitor. There was a thing happening inside of Elias that no one in the auditorium could see. He had taken that abandoned printout home 14 months earlier. He had come closer to the answer than anyone in the published literature had, and he had been stuck a single step short for months. The question was not new to him. He had been living with it line by line for over a year. The countdown reached 1 minute and 45 seconds. The audience watched him watching the board. Amelia smiled at the cameras and waited for the moment to expire. The mop was still in his right hand. The bucket was on his left. He could put both down and walk out the rear door, and not one person in this room would think about him by lunch. But the chalk was on the tray, and the equation was on the board, and he had been living with it for 14 months. He set the mop carefully against the wall, the way a man sets down something he intends to come back to. He stepped over the cord of his bucket. He walked up the side aisle. The first laugh came from the middle of the room. It died him. By the time he reached the third row, the auditorium had gone quiet, in a way it had not been quiet a minute earlier. Heads turned to follow him. A student in an aisle seat lowered his phone and then raised it again. Hannah Pierce sat very still in her seat near the front, watching him climb the side stairs of the stage. He climbed the 3 steps. Amelia turned and saw him properly for the first time in 9 years of working in the same building. Whatever she had been about to say to the cameras did not come out of her mouth. The smile she had been wearing did not entirely leave her face, but it lost some of its shape. He crossed in front of her without looking at her. He walked to the podium. He picked up the chalk. The chalk was slightly worn down at one end. He turned it the right way around without thinking. The auditorium went completely silent. It was the silence of 300 people trying to decide what kind of moment they had walked into. Behind him, the countdown read 1 minute and 20 seconds. The cameras held steady. In a graduate dorm across the river, a former classmate of his watched the stream and slowly sat forward in his chair, recognizing a face he had not seen in many years. The viewer count on Amelia's official live stream had quietly tripled in the last 60 seconds. For almost a decade, he had stayed small inside this building. He had cleaned the offices of people who had once been his peers. He had read their chalk and emptied their trash and walked the same hallways as a man who was not really there. He could put the chalk back down. No one in this room had expected anything of him to begin with, but the equation was on the board, and the answer was almost in his hand. And for the first time in 9 years, Elias Reed decided he would let himself be seen. The countdown read 1 minute and 17 seconds when Elias began to read. He stood with his back to the audience and his eyes on the chalkboard. The conjecture was written in Amelia's careful loops, the kind of handwriting that announced certainty. He let his eyes travel down the first line, the second, the third. Seeing the expression in chalk in someone else's hand was a small dislocation, like hearing a song you have always sung back to you by a stranger. Amelia came around the side of the podium. Her smile was still in place, but the edges of it had begun to harden. "Take your time," she said into the microphone. Her voice was light, almost amused. "We have 1 minute and 15 seconds. A few people in the audience laughed, but the laughter was thinner than it had been a minute earlier. Most of the room was watching the back of the janitor, and not the professor. Elias did not turn around. He raised his hand and tapped the chalk against the third line of the conjecture, twice the way a man checks a wall to see if it is load-bearing. Behind him, Amelia turned to the cameras and lifted her hands in a small, theatrical shrug. "He's reading it," she said, the way a teacher might describe a slow student to the rest of the class. The audience laughed again, but the laughter was already softening at the edges. He had read every published attempt at the Carter conjecture, had memorized 2 of them. He had assumed the way every other person who had ever looked at this problem had assumed that Amelia's framing of the question was sound. The constraint she had introduced in her original paper, the small, almost decorative condition she had placed on the structure in her opening lines, had been treated as a property of the underlying problem. 3 different research teams had spent 9 years working inside that constraint, producing partial results that contradicted each other in ways no one could explain. He had wondered late at night in his basement room why all 3 published attempts had arrived at almost answers that pointed in 3 different directions. 3 smart teams, real mathematicians on each, and yet 3 different near misses. He had not let himself ask whether Amelia had stated the question correctly in the first place. It was not a property of the problem. It was an assumption she had made. He had been staring at her assumption for 14 months without seeing it, and everyone in the field had done the same. Standing at the board, now seeing it in her own hand, in chalk, with one small change in notation she had introduced for the symposium's clarity, he saw it nakedly. She had put it there because she had believed it followed. It did not follow. He could simply discard it. The countdown read 1 minute and 8 seconds. Elias lifted the small eraser from the chalk tray and wiped a single character off of the third line of the Carter conjecture. The chalk dust drifted down to the tray. Then he wrote a different character in its place, in his own small handwriting, not Amelia's loops. The room did not understand at first. Amelia did. She had been standing slightly behind him, reading over his shoulder, and the moment the chalk made contact with the corrected character, the smile on her face suddenly did not have anywhere to go. "What are you doing?" she said. It was not a question. It was the first thing she had said all morning that was not staged. Elias did not answer. He took a step back from the board and looked at the equation again. The constraint he had carried for 14 months had dissolved. The expression that had followed from it laid itself out in his head with the calm of something that had been waiting for permission. He began to write. The chalk moved fast, but cleanly. His handwriting was small and economical, the handwriting of a man who had filled hundreds of pages in maintenance room solitude. He wrote the substitution that the second published team had attempted, and then erased 2 characters from the result, replacing them with a form none of the published teams had ever considered. The form was simpler than what they had tried. It worked because Amelia's assumption was gone. The first transformation went up in 7 seconds. The second took longer because he wanted to write the substitution clearly enough that anyone watching could follow. The third he wrote without slowing down. By the end of the third line, he had crossed a boundary that no one in the published literature had ever crossed. In the front row, Hannah Pierce was leaning forward in her seat. She had been a teaching assistant for 2 years and had graded several hundred problem sets, and she knew what good math looked like on a board. What she was watching now was the cleanest sequence of moves she had ever seen anyone perform in real time. There was no doubling back, no erasing, no second guessing. Every line was meant. Every line followed. 2 rows behind her, a professor named Mark Lansing slowly took his glasses off. He had attempted the Carter conjecture during his postdoc and had abandoned the attempt after 8 months inside the same constraint as everyone else. He looked at the man at the board, then at his colleague next to him. "He's not pulling from any of the published approaches," Lansing said quietly. "He's doing something else." The colleague did not answer. The colleague was watching the chalk. In the second row from the back, Daniel Whitman stood up. He did not walk forward. He simply stood, because standing changed how he could see. A few people noticed and stood up after him. A graduate student in row 4 was the next to rise, and then 4 more after her. By the time the countdown read 48 seconds, nearly a third of the auditorium was on its feet, and no one was telling anyone else to sit back down. Phones came up across the room. A graduate student in row 8 whispered something loudly enough for the row in front to hear, and the row in front did not turn to look at her, because the row in front was already saying something similar under its breath. Amelia had not moved. She was still half a step behind Elias, watching the board over his shoulder, the smile entirely gone from her face. She was a mathematician. She could read what he was writing. She could see the way only the original author of the conjecture could see that the line he had just produced was correct. She could also see what it meant. If the line was correct, then her constraint, the one she had stated in her opening paper 9 years earlier and defended in 3 follow-up papers since, was not a property of the problem. It was a mistake she had made. For 9 years, the entire field had taken her at her word and worked inside the box she had drawn without knowing the box was wrong. Her career had been built inside that box. Every paper she had published on the conjecture lived inside it. The Carter conjecture, the medal she had not worn on her chest, but had carried in the way she walked into rooms, all of it lived inside a constraint she had invented. She felt something cold move in her stomach that would not go away. Elias kept writing. Outside the auditorium, the live stream count had crossed 42,000 and was climbing. Graduate students at 3 different universities were watching from their offices. A retired professor in Stuttgart was watching from his living room. The man Elias had once shared a doctoral cohort with was watching from a small apartment in Cambridge, where he had spent the last 6 minutes leaning forward and saying nothing. He had not seen the face of his old classmate in 9 years. Amelia took a slow step away from the board. She walked to the podium. Her hand found the edge of the wood. The cameras tracked her without moving away from him. She had to do something. She could feel the room sliding away from her, watching the back of a man in coveralls instead of her. The way audiences slide when they have decided a story is more interesting than its host. She could not let him finish. Not in front of the cameras. Not with her name on the screen and her conjecture on the board. She turned her head slightly and read the name tag stitched on his shoulder. Elias Reed. The name surfaced from somewhere, not from this building, from years earlier. She had heard it 9 years before when she was a first-year assistant professor, and a man she had once met at a conference had been hospitalized. The man's graduate students had quietly dispersed. A memo had circulated about the closure of his program. One of the names on the list of affected students had stayed in the back of her memory. She had not thought of it in years. She had it now. She leaned toward the microphone and waited until the camera was on her face. "Mr. Reed," she said. Her voice had the calm of someone who has just decided to do a thing she has not done before. "That is your name, isn't it? Elias Reed." He did not turn. The chalk kept moving. "Before you finish your performance," she said, "I think the audience deserves to know who they are watching." A small, uneasy noise moved through the auditorium. It was not laughter. A few of the people who had stood up sat back down. A few stayed standing because they had not decided yet which side of the room they were in. Mr. Reed enrolled in a doctoral program in mathematics at another university 9 years ago. Amelia continued. Her voice was steady, her cadence careful. He did not complete it. He withdrew before his second-year exams. He has spent the last 9 years working maintenance jobs. He has no peer-reviewed publications. He has not, to my knowledge, attended a mathematics conference in any capacity in nearly a decade. She turned to the cameras with a tight, almost gentle smile. "I admire the spirit," she said. "I really do. But I think it is important that we are honest about what we are watching. We are watching a man who could not finish his own dissertation, attempting in 2 minutes to correct a problem that has defeated 3 teams of trained mathematicians over 9 years. That isn't a comeback story. That is a man trying to claim something he gave up on a long time ago." The chalk stopped. It stopped for the first time since Elias had picked it up. He stood very still in front of the board. The countdown read 36 seconds. The hand holding the chalk was no longer steady. The cameras held their frames. The technician at the back of the auditorium did not adjust them. He had stopped following the audio cues from Amelia 30 seconds earlier without realizing it. He was watching the chalk. The thing she had said about him was not a lie. He had withdrawn. He had not finished. The advisor he had loved had not come back from the hospital that May, and the apartment he had been renting had ended its lease the same month, and the savings he had been living on had dropped below a number that was not survivable for a graduate student. He had gone to the department office on a Wednesday morning with the withdrawal form already filled out, because he had wanted no one to talk him out of it. He had been 29 years old. He had felt 80. He remembered walking out of that office with the signed form folded in his coat pocket. There had been a graduate student lounge 2 doors down, and he had passed it without looking inside. He had walked 7 blocks before he realized he had not been crying. The feeling had come later. The feeling was still coming now. He had spent 9 years inside this building, pretending that the version of him in the photograph taped to the inside of his notebook did not exist. He had walked the same hallway as his old field for 9 years and had answered to the building's idea of him every time. He had thought more than once about leaving Boston. He had not asked himself the harder question, which was whether he had stayed, because staying invisible was easier than starting over, with a face people might look at. And now, a woman he had never spoken to had told 300 people in a packed auditorium and through 3 cameras to mathematics departments in 3 different countries exactly what he had been most ashamed of. Something old and quiet inside him wanted very badly to put the chalk down, to walk back to the mop he had set against the wall, to go back to being invisible. He had been good at invisible for almost a decade. He let the thought have its full size. He looked at the chalk in his hand. He looked at the equation on the board. The countdown read 31 seconds. In the front row, Hannah Pierce was no longer sure she was breathing. She had stood up at some point without realizing it, and she stayed standing now because sitting down would have felt like agreeing with something she did not agree with. She did not know the man at the board. She had said good morning to him in an elevator once on a snowy morning the previous February. That was the entire history she had with him. She could feel in her chest that what was about to happen would matter to him for the rest of his life, regardless of which way it went. He did not look at her. He did not know she was there. He was working through a thing in himself that no one else in the room could see. What hurt was not what Amelia had said. What hurt was that he had agreed with her for 9 years. He had let the building call him a janitor, and he had answered to it. He had let the people who walked past him without looking up tell him who he was, and he had walked past himself the same way. He had spent 9 years carrying a notebook full of work that he had not believed was worth showing to anyone, because he had decided in advance that no one would want to see it. The version of him in the photograph had not been the failure. The failure had been everything he had done since. He had built a private life around a problem no one had asked him to solve. He had not built it for Amelia. He had not built it for Harvard. He had built it because the work had been worth doing. The countdown read 29 seconds. He raised his head. He turned back to the board. He set the chalk to the line he had been about to write. He was not finishing the proof for Amelia anymore. He was not finishing it for the cameras. He was finishing it because the work was worth finishing, and because for 9 years he had let himself forget that. He started writing again. The chalk moved cleanly. The auditorium watched the back of his coveralls in the kind of silence that doesn't need to be asked for. The substitution went onto the board in 5 seconds. He stepped back, half a pace, read it once, and wrote the next line beneath it. In the second row from the back, Daniel Whitman watched the second line appear and felt the small, specific feeling that mathematicians feel when they recognize that a thing they had assumed was impossible has just become not only possible, but obvious. He had read all 3 of the published attempts on the Carter conjecture. He had supervised a graduate student through 8 months of work inside Amelia's framing, and had watched the student abandon the problem in tears the previous spring. The line now on the board did not exist inside that framing. The door to a different room had been a single character. 21 seconds. Elias wrote the line that he had reached on his own a month earlier, the line that had stopped him cold for 30 straight nights because it had pointed to a contradiction inside Amelia's constraint. Without the constraint, the line did not contradict anything. It opened. He wrote what it opened into, and the chalk made a small, clean sound against the board with each character. Somewhere in the 3rd row, a graduate student with a phone held very still in front of her stopped breathing for about 4 seconds, and then started again without noticing. Mark Lansing turned his head a fraction of a degree toward the colleague beside him and spoke without taking his eyes off the board. "That's not a new technique," he said, almost too quietly to Carrie. "He's using the second team substitution. He's just not carrying her constraint through it." The colleague did not answer. The colleague had figured it out 4 seconds earlier and was trying to remember whether he had ever in his career watched a mathematician do something like this in real time. 14 seconds. Elias wrote the penultimate line. He wrote it slower than the others, not because he was unsure of it, but because he wanted it readable. He had spent 14 months in a basement room with this expression, and he wanted whoever watched the recording later to be able to follow what he had done without being a number theorist. The handwriting was small and even. It was the handwriting of a man who had taught himself alone to write so that the page would survive his own second guessing. 11 seconds. He set the chalk to the board for the final line. He did not hesitate. He wrote the closing expression in a single unbroken motion, ended it with the small notation he had always used in his notebooks. A horizontal stroke under the last character, the way his advisor had taught him to mark a result he was prepared to defend. He set the chalk back in the tray. He took 1 step back from the board. He did not turn around. The countdown above the screen read 7 seconds, and then 4, and then it stopped, and the auditorium held its silence, the way a room holds the silence after a bell. Daniel Whitman walked down the side aisle. He did it without announcing it. He climbed the 3 steps to the stage. He passed Amelia without looking at her, the way a man passes a thing he intends to come back to. He stopped at the board and read every line from the top, slowly the way he had read chalkboard work in this same building for 30 years. He read the corrected character on the 3rd line. He read the substitution. He read the line that had stopped Elias for 30 nights. He read the penultimate line. He read the final expression. He stood there for somewhere between 11 and 14 seconds without moving. Then he turned to the auditorium. "This is correct," he said. His voice was not loud. He did not need it to be. The microphone at the podium picked it up, and the cameras carried it to the 3 countries where mathematics departments had quietly turned on their morning streams. I want to be clear about what I am saying. I am the chair of this department. I have read every published attempt on this problem. The work on this board is correct. It is also, in my professional opinion, the first complete proof of the Carter conjecture that has ever existed. For Beeman, the auditorium did not erupt. The auditorium did something stranger and quieter than that. The 2 students who had been filming for the laughs lowered their phones, looked at each other, and then raised the phones again because they understood. In the way young people sometimes understand, a moment ahead of the adults around them, that the recording mattered now. A graduate student in row 8 started crying without making any noise. The faculty member from the physics department, who had been leaning against the back wall, straightened up and walked slowly toward the front. Amelia had not moved from where she was standing beside the podium. She had been a mathematician long enough to read what was on the board the moment Elias had finished writing it. She had not needed Whitman to tell her. She had known at the penultimate line. She had known, in fact, at the 3rd line, where Elias had erased her character and written his own, because the 3rd line was where her career had ended, and she had been watching it end in real time for the last 120 seconds. Whitman's announcement was not new information. It was a public ratification of a thing she had already privately accepted with the calm of a woman who had spent her entire adult life learning to read chalk. She looked down at her hand on the edge of the podium. The hand was steady. She had not expected it to be steady. The cameras were on her. She had positioned them herself 2 days earlier. She lifted her head and looked at the back of the man in coveralls who had still not turned around. He was looking at the board. He was reading what he had just written, the way a man reads a letter he has finally finished and is not sure he is going to send. She had told the audience 2 minutes ago that she would publicly apologize to any person who solved the conjecture in 2 minutes on this stage in front of all of Harvard. She had said it as a joke. She had said it the way a person sets a price on a thing they do not believe will ever be bought. She could feel now the shape of the choice that had landed in front of her. She could refuse. She could attack his withdrawal again harder. She could turn to the cameras and say something about chain of custody, about peer review, about how a proof on a chalkboard in 2 minutes was not a proof until it had been verified in a journal. She could buy herself a week, maybe 2. She was not going to do that. She was tired of a thing she had not known she was tired of. She had said the previous week in the faculty lounge that the alternative to being unbeatable was worse. She had not at the time been sure she meant it. She walked away from the podium. She crossed the stage. She stopped about 4 feet from Elias and waited until he turned his head to acknowledge her, which he did slowly. The way a man turns toward a person he has been aware of for 9 years without speaking to. "I owe you an apology," she said. Her voice was steady, and she did not move it toward the microphone because she did not want the apology to be a performance. "I owe you several. The first is for what I said about your withdrawal. I used a private chapter of your life to discredit work I could already see was correct. I knew it was correct, and I did it anyway. That was the worst thing I have done in this building, and I have done it in front of 3 cameras. She looked at the board behind him. "The second apology is for the constraint. I introduced it 9 years ago, and I defended it in 3 subsequent papers, and I was wrong. The field worked inside a box I built for 9 years. I do not know yet what that costs. I will find out." She turned to the auditorium. The cameras tracked her. "I promised this room a public apology and a letter of recommendation," she said. "Mr. Reed has both. I will write the letter today. The apology is the one I am giving now." She walked back to the podium, picked up her notes, folded them in half, and set them down again. She did not pick them back up. Whatever talk she had prepared for the next 35 minutes of the symposium was no longer the talk this room was waiting for. In a small apartment across the river in Cambridge, a man named Peter Vance was sitting forward on the edge of a couch with a laptop balanced on the coffee table in front of him. He had not moved for the last 6 minutes. He had been in the same doctoral cohort as Elias, nearly a decade earlier, and he had stayed in academia after Elias had withdrawn. He picked up his phone and started typing a message. He did not know if the number he had was still good. He sent it anyway. Inside the auditorium, Hannah Pierce had finally sat back down because her legs were not cooperating. She watched Daniel Whitman step toward Elias and shake his hand. And she watched Elias accept the handshake, the way a person accepts a thing he has not been offered in a long time, with a small unsureness in the shoulders that nobody in the room would have caught if they had not been looking for it. She decided in her seat in the front row that she would learn his name properly today, and that she would say it out loud the next time she saw him in the hallway. The symposium did not resume. Whitman, after a quiet exchange with Amelia that the microphone did not catch, stepped to the podium and told the auditorium that the morning's program would adjourn early, that the recording would be made available for review by the department, and that a verification committee would convene the following week to formally examine the proof. He thanked the audience for their attention. He did not thank Amelia, which was a thing several people in the room noticed without commenting on. Elias did not leave the stage right away. He stood in front of the board for a moment longer, looking at the work, and then he turned and walked back down the side stairs the way he had come up. His bucket was still by the rear door. The mop was still leaned against the wall. He picked them both up. The audience, the cameras, the live stream, all of it, watched him collect his cleaning supplies and push them out the rear door of the auditorium, because that was where his cart was, and because the floors he had been responsible for at 5 that morning were still floors he had been responsible for at 10. He did not go back to the basement room that afternoon. He went to the second floor and finished the rounds he had not completed before the symposium had started. He emptied trash cans in offices whose occupants were standing in hallways, watching the live stream replay on their phones. He mopped the long marble hallway outside the dean's suite, while 3 faculty members walked past him in the opposite direction, all 3 of them looking at him this time, none of them quite sure what the correct thing was to say. He nodded at them the way he always nodded. The hallway felt longer than usual and shorter than usual both at the same time. At 4 in the afternoon, a graduate student he had never spoken to before knocked on the doorframe of the supply closet, where he was restocking paper towels, and told him that the chair of the department was looking for him. He thanked her and finished restocking the paper towels. He went up to the second floor. Daniel Whitman was in his office with the door open. He stood when Elias walked in. He did not sit back down for the first 3 minutes of the conversation, which were the minutes in which he told Elias that the department would, with his permission, sponsor his readmission to a doctoral program, that funding had already been informally arranged, that the work he had done that morning would be co-authored only with his consent and submitted under his name as lead. Elias listened. He did not say yes, and he did not say no. He said that he would think about it. He said that he had thought about a lot of things while he had been mopping the floor that morning, and that one more thing was not difficult. Whitman smiled at that, the way a man smiles at a sentence he intends to remember. He shook Elias's hand again before he left. He said on his way out the door that a chalkboard in his own office had been wrong for 3 weeks, and that he had heard, from somewhere that Elias had noticed. Elias looked at him for a moment and said, yes, he had. Whitman nodded slowly. He said he would fix it that night. He said he should have noticed it himself. That evening, after the building had emptied, Elias went down to the basement. He sat at the folding table under the lamp he had bought across the river. He took out the legal pad he had been using and opened it to a blank page. He did not write anything for a long time. The photograph taped to the inside of the front cover was still there. He looked at it the way he had not looked at it in 9 years, which was to say, he looked at it as a person he was related to, not a person he had failed to become. He thought about the man in Cambridge, whose message had come through on his phone at noon, and about the message he had not yet answered, and about the message he would answer that night. He thought about the woman in the front row, whose name he did not yet know, but whose face he had registered twice now in the corner of his memory, once in an elevator on a snowy February morning, and once in the 3rd minute of a 2-minute countdown, when she had stood up in her seat for a reason she could not have explained at the time. He did not know yet whether he would accept the department's offer. He did not know yet how many universities would email him in the next week, or how many of those emails he would open. He did not know yet that Amelia Carter would 3 months later publish a retraction of her 3 follow-up papers under her own name, and that the retraction would be the most respected piece of writing of her career, and that she would refer to him in it not as Mr. Reed, but as Elias, and that she would mean it. What he knew, sitting under the lamp in the basement room he had built for himself with no one's permission, was that he had let 9 years of his life go by inside a building that had been willing to call him invisible because he had been willing to answer to it. He had let a room of 300 people laugh at him that morning, and he had picked up the chalk anyway, and he had finished the work because the work had been worth finishing, and somewhere in the middle of the proof, in the small motion of his hand against the board, he had stopped being a man who was hiding and started being a man who was working in public. He closed the notebook. He turned off the lamp. He sat for a moment in the dark of the basement, listening to the building above him. He had not decided yet what he was going to do next, but he had decided somewhere in the last 12 hours that he was not going to decide it from inside a room he was hiding in. He stood up. He pushed the folding chair under the table. He walked up the basement stairs. He turned the hallway light off behind him as he went, the way he had every night for 9 years, and for the first time in 9 years, he did not feel as the light went out that he was disappearing with it.